Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So greetings and welcome, Marc. It's great to have you on the podcast show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we go into the heart of the conversation, I do always like to ask my guests something about their origin story, their background. What did you study at university? And was it inevitable that you'd end up in academia and the policy world?
Sure. I guess I'll give you the real short version, which is that I've been a Social Security nerd since college. I did a couple of internships in the topic. I wrote my senior thesis on the politics of Social Security reform. Turns out it's super easy. No, I'm just kidding. And after that, I was looking for a job in the Social Security field, and that's actually how I started working for my current organization, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I started here in 2007. And other than two temporary leaves to go work on nonpartisan commissions, I've been here ever since.
Wow, so you really do like this topic. And just for the benefit of our audience, what is the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget?
Yeah, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that focuses on fiscal issues. We believe in responsible budgeting, which doesn't mean balance per se, but it means your debt can't grow faster than your economy forever, and that borrowing should be saved for when it's actually needed. And so we do advocate for that. We have a watchdog role, trying to prevent politicians from sort of lying, cheating, and stealing their way into higher deficits. But a lot of what we do is really just analysis, trying to help the public, the press, and especially Hill staff who are very busy and members of Congress to understand very complicated fiscal issues in easy, digestible ways.
Okay, that's great. So there is non-partisan. So you're not affiliated.
We work with Republicans and Democrats. Our board is divided, I think, probably about 40-40-20 between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. They don't agree on everything, but they do agree on the desirability of responsible budgeting.
Okay, great. Okay, that's good to know. Good that we get that out of the way. Now, in terms of the U.S. budget deficit, maybe we can just start with some of the some of the foundations here. So, the budget deficit, how big is it? What's the structure of it? What's the likely path of it? Let's go through some of the the high level takes here.
So last year's deficit was effectively $2 trillion, which was twice as high as the $1 trillion deficit in 2022. You get a deficit by the difference between your spending and your revenue. So it's hard to say what is a cause, but we spent about $6.5 trillion and we raised about $4.5 trillion. That's that gap. Our revenue is relatively low right now. It's below historic average. We lose a lot of money each year through various tax breaks, through compliance issues, but our spending is also extremely high. In recent years, we've seen substantial growth in our major health and retirement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We've started to see interest costs really rise, especially over the last year. And the defense and non-defense discretionary parts of the budget also have been growing at a healthy pace due to some very large appropriations bills. So it's really, in all parts of the budget, we're spending more, and we're just not raising enough to keep up. That $2 trillion, you put it as a share of GDP, it's about 7.5%. That is unprecedented, other than during a deep recession or a war. We've never had deficits so high at a time when unemployment is, less than 4%, and we're not directly engaged in a major war like a World War II or Korea. We've just never had deficits like this before. And if you look at the path going forward, it's not going to let up much. Next year or this year might be a little bit better than last year. But if you look over the next 10 years, what you'll see is deficits are projected to remain over $2 trillion a year. Our debt as a share of the economy will probably hit a record level sometime in the next few years. Our interest costs are going to go way past their record level. And then over the long term, everything just keeps getting worse.
And in terms of, you mentioned the budget deficit's been record levels in peacetime. Why didn't the COVID-related spending subside? I mean, surely there's a COVID-related spike in spending. Shouldn't that have just rolled off? I mean, why did it stay?
So it did. So we ran a deficit of about $1 trillion in 2019. Then in 2020 and 2021, it was about $3 trillion a year. A lot of that was COVID spending, right? 2 trillion of that was COVID spending. And then 2022, we're back to $1 trillion. So it seemed like things were normal. But it turned out that as that COVID spending was rolling off, the underlying growth of Social Security, Medicare, and interest were really taking hold in a meaningful way. And 2022 was a bit of an anomaly year. We had a really good revenue year, mainly because of the huge stock market gains the year earlier, and also inflation. Inflation boosts taxable income immediately. The tax code's indexed, but that's on a lag. So we had a really good year in 2022, but 2023 was more of a normal year, maybe even a little bit worse. And while the COVID relief is gone, it's essentially been replaced in part by higher spending on Social Security, Medicare, and interest.
And that higher spending on those items, is that linked to inflation? Like, is there index-linked spending that just kicks in, or is there something
So
else?
inflation is a piece of this. But again, if I look at a share of GDP, inflation's not a major factor there because the GDP is also growing effectively with inflation. So inflation explains some of the time distortions between when these dollars pay, but doesn't really explain the underlying issue, which is just that overall healthcare costs, not just inflation, but overall healthcare costs are rising faster than the economy. We're getting older as a population, so more and more people are becoming eligible for Social Security and Medicare, and our revenue just isn't keeping up. And a lot of that part is because politicians keep cutting taxes over and over and over again, cutting off any built-in growth there would otherwise be in a revenue collection.
And so if we sort of linger a bit more on the tax side, has it always been, have there been instances in modern US history where tax revenue as a share of GDP has actually gone up? Say from the 80s onwards. Let's kind of narrow it down to that time frame.
So our tax code is generally designed in a way that revenue should be going up year after year. The reason is that the tax code is indexed to inflation, but incomes grow faster than inflation. So more and more people should be in higher and higher brackets. The issue is that while we have this linear trend up, every few years, politicians decide to cut taxes back down. And so what we've seen is, revenue will bounce up and down. It's averaged about 17.5% of GDP. Right now it's 16.5. It's peaked around 20. But every time it starts to get high, politicians seem to respond by cutting taxes. That was maybe affordable back when, back in 2001 when we were running surpluses. I find it hard to believe that it's affordable today with deficits already so large.
And on the spending side, are there different dynamics for the three big items that you mentioned: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? I mean, are they caused by the same underlying factors, or are there some distinctions between the three?
So I'll say, I don't want to give a free pass to the defense and non-defense discretionary because politicians until this year have been doing like 8% a year increases in these programs. So the appropriators have been out of control, but they don't have underlying built-in growth. Every year we have to decide the defense budget, right? And every year we could choose to not grow by 8%. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, those are all mandatory programs that are built that pay based on a formula, and they have built-in growth. And for Social Security and Medicare in particular, that growth has accelerated as the baby boom population has retired. We're getting older as a society. More and more people are getting on these programs. In the case of Medicare, they're also getting older, and so older Medicare beneficiaries are more expensive. There's a lot more health expenditures for a 90-year-old than a 65-year-old, for example. And so that aging of the population, that's driving up the cost of Social Security and Medicare. Rising healthcare costs, that's driving up the cost of Medicare and Medicaid. So like Medicare really has these two symptoms, aging and healthcare, and Social Security, it's mainly the aging, and Medicaid, it's mainly the healthcare. But I will also say that underlying this is formulas that accommodate each of these programs for the aging of the population. So for example, Social Security benefits for new beneficiaries grow each year with wages. That was a choice we made. If they only grew with inflation, Social Security would be affordable right now.
Okay. And these formulas, when were they made?
There's a great book by a man named Gene Storley called Dead Man Ruling. And basically what he argues in this book is that most of the way that the government allocates money, most of the way that it taxes and spends, is based on decisions from people that are not only not elected, but aren't even alive anymore, right? Because we created Social Security in the 30s, we created Medicare in the 60s. Yes, we've updated them from time to time, but the last major change to Social Security was 1983. We've made some minor changes since then, but really, the current Social Security formula was really built in the 70s, in 72, and then modified in 77. And then the last change we made, of any significance, was 1983. These formulas were made by, again, people that not only were not elected by current Americans, but aren't even alive today.
And is it difficult to make adjustments to these formulas because there's so many vested interests, or is it just because it's not headline grabbing, so people don't look at that? Instead, they just look at taxes or something.
It's incredibly difficult. I remember I said I wrote my senior thesis on the politics of Social Security reform. Social Security has been in financial trouble essentially since 1974, and there have been about 6 or 7 major presidential attempts, maybe 8 major presidential attempts to try to rein in. Only 2 were successful. Most of the times when presidents try to fix Social Security, they fail. Most of the time, actually, they don't even try. It's so hard they don't even try. It is incredibly hard. There's vested interest on both sides. People don't want changes to their taxes. They don't want changes to their benefits. They don't want changes to their retirement age. But here's the reality of Social Security. This one in particular, it's a self-financed program. Your payroll taxes go to pay current benefits. And when its reserves run out in 10 years, it is not able to pay full benefits. Social Security is 10 years from insolvency, meaning in 2033, it will not have enough money to pay full benefits. The law at that point calls for a 23% across the board benefit cut. For a typical new couple, that's a $17,000 cut in benefits. That's what happens if we do nothing. And so I do think at some point, the interest will change and the cost of doing nothing will start to outweigh the cost of doing something. Sadly, we're not there yet.
And so Social Security, the biggest component of that is it pensions, or is it supplemental sort of income while you're working?
Yeah, Social Security is mainly it's a retirement program. It's mainly a retirement program. It provides several other kinds of benefits. It has a disability benefit, it has a survivor's benefit, but the largest chunk of Social Security, and the one that's also most in most dire financial straits, is its retirement program. And we're living longer. Our workforce is not growing essentially at all. And so that means that Social Security can't survive in the way that it did before. We either need to have each worker paying more in than they're used to, each beneficiary bringing out less than they're used to, people working longer, or some combination of those 3 things.
Yeah, there's no way out of the basic maths there. I did want to come back to the defense, some of the discretionary spending. During the Iraq and Afghanistan war, how did that affect the budget deficit? And presumably, as those ended, things improved on that side. Just what's been the story on say the defense side?
Yeah, the story of the defense is we had a very I mean, I don't know how far back we want to go, but we had huge defense spending in World War II, right? That kind of gradually waned. President Reagan in 81 really rebuilt up our defense. We won the Cold War. We then had a peace dividend in the 90s and up until 2001. And then we started spending $100 billion a year, roughly. It's different each year, on Iraq and Afghanistan. Then that rolled off. But now, I mean, there's all sorts of new dangers. We have money for Ukraine and potentially for Israel and Gaza and Taiwan. So there are always new threats, it seems like. And while defense spending has shrunk a little bit as a share of the economy, it has continued to grow on average significantly faster than the rate of inflation.
And we haven't mentioned, say, education. I mean, how big an item is, say, education?
Not too big overall. So about a quarter of the budget is appropriated every year, defense and non-defense appropriations. Half of that is defense. So you're talking about an eighth of the budget. That is a lot of things you probably think of as the core functions of government: Department of Energy, all the federal workers, Department of Interior, EPA, State Department, Homeland Security, FBI. and education is within there. So education is a tiny share of the federal budget. In part, it's because there's honestly a lot more seniors than there are kids. We spend $6 per senior for every $1 we spend per kid in the United States. The budget is really heavily skewed towards seniors versus kids. Part of that is just there's more seniors. Part of that is the state and local governments, they do most of the education financing.
Yeah.
The federal role is to sort of help with lower income areas and areas that are accommodating a lot more students with disabilities. That's essentially the federal role, and the state and local governments are covering the rest. But a lot of it, I think, is that we just don't prioritize kids relative to the elderly in the United States. The elderly have by far the lowest poverty rate. Kids have among the highest. If you look at the budget process, programs for kids tend to be appropriated, mean they're not on autopilot. They tend to expire, meaning we have to address them every 1 year, maybe 5 years. They don't tend to have their own dedicated revenue sources, and they don't tend to have any built-in growth. Whereas programs for seniors are mostly automatic with big built-in growth with no expiration. Seniors are just heavily favored in the federal budget process relative to kids.
I mean, when you put it in those terms, it really does seem quite stark, in terms of how the sort of system is skewed. And it makes you worry about the long-term potential of a society or an economy when it's set up in that way.
I do worry. I mean, where investments have gotten better in the last few years, although they're not mainly human investments, they're mainly investments in infrastructure and green technology, et cetera. But in general, our budget is really skewed towards consumption. People want stuff now. The voters want lower taxes. They want, better healthcare. They want bigger social security benefits. The budget does not favor kids. In fact, last year, the federal government spent more on interest on the debt than everything it spent on kids. That's not just education. That's education, child tax credit, child healthcare, school lunches. You add it all up together, we spent more on interest servicing our past debt than we did on children investing in our future. That's backwards.
Hmm. And you mentioned interest there, so I have to come to that. And many of our audience are financial market participants, and you look at the level of interest rates, and many people have been sort of projecting that out, and it looks quite horrific. I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, we enjoyed 15 years of very low interest rates. The economy grew faster than interest, which was didn't guarantee debt sustainability, but certainly helped with our debt sustainability. Those low interest rates meant that we had more room for everything else in the budget. They also helped in the private sector, made it easier to, a lot of people have below 3% mortgages. It was easier for businesses to invest, for venture capitalists to take more risks. There were all sorts of benefits. There may be a lot of cost of low interest rates as well, in terms of creating more kind of zombie investments and things like that. That era, at least temporarily, is over. Maybe we'll come back. Maybe we will have low interest rates again. I'm skeptical, but maybe we will. But for now, we're in a high interest rate environment. The average treasury bond is paying about 5%. The short-term ones are paying 5.5%. The long-term ones are paying, we'll see when this airs, but probably in the high fours. And that's really expensive for the government. It means that interest is a growing share of the budget. If interest rates remain about 1% above what was projected, which is roughly where they are now, interest will be the second largest government program by 2026. It will blow past defense, blow past Medicare. If interest rates stay that high, and then high debt pushes them up further, which kind of in the theory we think we will, eventually we'll have serious debt sustainability issues where high interest is leading to higher debt, is leading to higher interest rates, is leading to higher interest, is leading to higher debt. And ultimately, maybe sometime in the 2050s or 2060s, we're to the point that it's hard to see how we're able to reel things back. So this is a big threat for the federal government. It's also, of course, a cost for businesses, for households, for those that want to buy a new car, you name it. These high interest rates are very expensive. I do think on the short end of the curve, meaning shorter term interest rates, I do think they're going to come down some as we get inflation under control and the Fed feels like it can ease up. But I'm not so sure when we look to the 10-year, the 30-year bonds. Those are sort of already assuming the Fed is going to ease up and they're this high. And so maybe they'll come down, maybe they won't.
And in terms of precedents, in terms of interest rate as a share, interest rate payments, are there historical reference points? Was the 70s, similar to today? Obviously, interest rates were way, way higher back then, but of course,
Yeah.
inflation was as well. So it's hard to kind of see. But like, what's the historical reference point?
So
Precedent?
here's the thing: real interest rates, meaning interest rates accounting for expected inflation, are high now, but they're not astronomical by our historic records. We've had interest rates this high. What we've never had is real interest rates this high. The interest rates are basically on average 3% above inflation. We've never had interest rates about 3% above inflation with debt that's also this high. So the last time we had debt that was close to the size of the economy after World War II, real interest rates were really low. They were actually negative. And the last time we had interest rates this high in the 90s, debt was relatively low. What we've never had before is both high interest rates and high debt. And that's the double whammy that could really get our debt unsustainable, that really could cause interest payments to start growing at a very rapid clip. It's hard to know exactly because it's hard to predict the future, but probably in the next 5 years, interest will hit a new record as a share of the economy. Federal payments on interest will be larger than they've ever been in our history. And that's not because interest rates will be the highest they've ever been. It's because interest rates will be high, relatively high, while debt will be the highest it's ever been.
I mean, so when I listen to you, it really sounds quite worrying. When in terms of projections, then it sounds like the budget deficit. You mentioned like 7.5% of share of GDP, which is incredibly large. For a peacetime economy, we're likely to stay at those levels. It sounds like for the foreseeable.
I think we're going to come down a little bit from that. I don't think we're going to be at 7.5%,
Yeah.
but I think we're likely to remain above 5 or 6%. And if you look at where we're headed, I think we're likely to be at 8, 9, 10% by the end of the decade.
Okay. And then you have this interest rate dynamic, which could bring into question sustainability for further down the line. So in terms of the impact of this on the economy, what does this, what does this all mean?
Yeah. So I think we are already seeing a lot of the consequences of unfettered borrowing. I think that while I supported a lot of the COVID relief, and a lot of it was necessary given our economic situation at the time and given the uncertainty, especially in 2020, I think it was a major cause of the inflation we saw in 2021 and 2022. Not the only cause, but a major cause. Now we're starting to see it flow into interest rates in a meaningful way. So I think we're already starting to see some of that cost of high borrowing. On the other hand, it could be a lot worse than it is. I'm surprised. We had some bank failures towards the beginning of the year. I'm surprised that those haven't become worse, that there's not more of those. And so credit to the Federal Reserve for how it's managed things. The US economy, for what it's worth, is the strongest economy in the history of the known universe. That gives us a big leg up, especially when, Europe and other potential rivals, economic rivals, also partners, aren't doing as well. So that's good news, but it's not guaranteed to last. I kind of think best case scenario, these high interest rates just do the normal thing. They crowd out investment. As we see these high interest rates, we do less investment in the future, slows our economic growth. The Congressional Budget Office has looked at this, and they've done an estimate that basically says that if debt kind of keeps going at current trajectory, income growth could slow by about a third over the next 30 years, which means we'll still have more income in 30 years than we do now, but only 2/3 as much more as we thought. And so that's pretty significant. We could slow income growth. But then there's this crisis case scenario where debt starts to get out of control, the markets start to panic, and there's a massive sell-off of the debt, and then we have a global financial crisis. And we can't, bail out the global financial crisis is because of our own debt. That's kind of the nightmare scenario.
Yeah. And we haven't talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill, so some of the non-COVID bills that got passed that were on the stimulus side. What's your take on those?
I think that, the American Rescue Plan in 2021 was $2 trillion put into the economy in a very short period of time. I think that was very inflationary, and I think it was very unfortunate because we knew better. We looked at state and local finances, and we saw that every state but Hawaii was running huge surpluses, and yet we send them another $500 billion. We looked at household balance sheets and saw they were very healthy, and yet we sent them another, $7,000 for a family of 5. So I think that was a big mistake and inflationary. The other bills, bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, you add these together, they were deficit increasing. The only one of them was sort of paid for. Looked like it was paid for, the Inflation Reduction Act, and in hindsight, it was probably closer to neutral because those credits cost more than we thought. Those are probably deficit increasing, but probably not particularly inflationary for two reasons. One, they don't spend that much per year. Those were kind of spent out over 10 years. The second being they had some pay-fors in them, both the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act in particular. And the third reason is while they created more demand, they also created more supply. Like if we look at the American Rescue Plan, that was just sending people cash to spend effectively. But these bills are actually focused on building new stuff. And so new demand hurts inflation, new supply helps inflation. Net, if I had to guess, those bills were kind of slightly inflationary overall, but not a major story here.
Okay, now I'm going to ask a very simple question. How do you fix the deficit problem?
Oh, so simple. We put out a blueprint about a year ago. We did an estimate at the time that you would need about $7 trillion to stabilize the debt. You probably need a similar amount now. There's no way to do this by looking at one part of the budget. For example, we hear some Republicans say, we want to cut spending, but don't touch Social Security, Medicare, or defense. To balance the budget without doing that, you have to cut everything else by 75%. The flip side, the Democratic president has said, I care about the deficit too, but I only want to raise taxes on people making over $400,000 and on corporations. Similar situation, you have to raise those taxes by 75% to get to the same outcome. That's impossible. That would put you above the revenue maximizing rate. So you're not going to get this by taking large programs off the table. You got to look at all areas. In our blueprint, we focus very heavily on healthcare. We've had about $1 trillion of healthcare savings. Mainly, this is from making healthcare more affordable and efficient. There's an incredible amount of waste in U.S. healthcare. We overpay for services. We allow and facilitate monopoly pricing. We have bad incentives that doctors want to treat more and patients want to buy more. We essentially let the states rip off the federal government by lying about the amount they spend. There's so much we can do that would lower healthcare costs for beneficiaries and for the government without actually kind of cutting or significantly cutting people's benefits or access to service. That I think was kind of the core of our plan, because not only could it help reduce deficits in the near term, it would also help fight inflation, strengthen the Medicare trust fund, and remember that growing costs over the long run are healthcare driven, so help a lot with the long term. But you also got to look at defense and non-defense discretionary.
Actually, before we go on to that,
Yeah.
on healthcare, Obama tried to deal with healthcare. The Clintons did. I mean, there's been various attempts to reform healthcare. And what do you think of those attempts? I mean, because from what you've said, it just makes a lot of sense. Make it more efficient, deal with monopolistic issues. But when these presidents try to deal with it, they come up with other programs, or perhaps they try to do this. Why hasn't people just done what you said? Because it sounds like it's a win-win.
I think the Clinton proposal was maybe just too ambitious for our political system. It was a wholesale overhaul of the healthcare system. It would have put healthcare in a national budget, and that probably would have worked to control costs, but it was just too ambitious. The Obama proposal actually had a lot of good ideas to control Medicare costs. The issue was all the savings went into new spending, right? Now our deficits are so high, we need to sort of do kind of a similar thing to what was done under Obama. Not the same policies, but the same types of policies. But these are similar policies, by the way, to ones that were proposed by President Trump. There's ideas here that both Elizabeth Warren and Newt Gingrich support, right? There's actually broad agreement from the left and the right on a lot of ways to control healthcare costs. But the secret is, if you want to reduce the deficit, that money actually has to go to deficit reduction. It can't go to new spending or new programs.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so historically, the issue is when you have had some success, they spend the savings, so
That's right.
So it helps the deficit overall.
That's right. But look, we can't do this just with healthcare. We're not going to solve the whole budget just with healthcare. We need long-term caps on the appropriators. Remember, I said the appropriators just increased 8% a year, do whatever they want. We do have caps in place now. They were negotiated earlier this year in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, but only 2-year caps. And the appropriators actually haven't followed them yet. So first of all, we need to follow the law. And then secondly, we need to extend those. We need to look to Social Security. That program has a significant imbalance. And so we're going to have to raise the amount of revenue coming in. For example, by lifting the amount of income subject to the cap, we're going to have to reduce the amount going out. For example, by making it more progressive. So, Jeff Bezos doesn't need to get quite as much Social Security as he's planning to get right now, and boosting the retirement age in a way that encourages people to work longer, which is good for the economy and actually good for people, but doesn't force them to work longer. And so people that actually need to retire can. But we got to make Social Security solvent. And then we got to look to other spending where there's a tremendous amount of waste, whether it's in higher education or farm subsidies or things like that. And then lastly, but not least importantly by all, we're going to need more tax revenue. We need income tax reform. We cannot extend the 2017 tax cuts without offsets. That would just be too expensive. In our particular framework, we suggested that you extend some parts of the expiring tax cuts and you pay for them by cutting various tax breaks. And then we proposed a new deficit reduction surtax that stays into effect on both corporations and individuals until the deficit is under control. We also proposed a carbon tax, which I think gives you the win-win of helping to reduce debt and also reduce the negative effects of greenhouse emissions on the earth.
And what about corporate tax in general? You mentioned the surcharge, but are US corporate taxes at the right level right now, or do you think they should go up? Or
look, when they were 35, I think that was too high. Every other country had cut their corporate rate besides us. Paul Ryan and Barack Obama were fighting over whether it should be 25 or 28. That was kind of the range of negotiation. And then Donald Trump came in and we cut it down to 21. So I don't think we got to go back to 35, but I think that if we're in the 25 to 28 range, maybe 24 to 28, I think we're going to be fine. Again, the way we proposed it is we suggested keep that 21% rate, but then have a surtax. And so, 21% rate plus 4% surtax is 25% effectively. The difference is if we ever get our deficit under control, that can go away. It's only there for deficit reduction, not for new spending. But in some ways, that's just a sales pitch more than sort of an economic argument. I think a corporate tax rate that's around 25 is perfectly fine. I also think we ought to be stricter in cutting corporate tax breaks. Individuals can only deduct $10,000 of state and local taxes, but corporations can deduct all their state and local taxes. Why not apply the same rules to both?
Yeah. And in terms of the fiscal setup in the US, the relationship, how Congress operates, the relationship between the executive and Congress, how do you think that's functioning at the moment compared
Not very
to
well.
to history? I mean, how worried are you, about the dysfunction of the whole setup there?
I mean, look, compared to other OECD countries, the United States is really the only one that has its debt that's projected to keep rising right now. The other countries, even if their debt is as high as ours, in some cases, they got a plan to bring it down. And I think it's directly related to the fact that we're pretty much the only one that has that doesn't have sort of a unitary system or something close to it. We're the only one that's not a parliamentary system or something close to it. We have so many veto points that in order to pass a law, you need essentially 60 out of 100 senators who are each elected independently from different states. You need the majority of House members from different congressional districts that are each elected independently, some very far right, some very far left, some in the center, depending on their districts. And you need the president to all agree on this. And even then, maybe it's not even their problem. Maybe it's a governor's problem. That's very hard. And back when most of the budget was appropriated each year, that maybe worked to our advantage. It made it easier to balance the budget. But now most of the budget is on autopilot. And so if we do nothing, things just get worse and worse and worse. And it is really hard to do something in the United States, even in the best of times. And this is not the best of times. Far from it. We have such a broken political system that is so partisan, that is so hard for them to work together that it's incredibly depressing.
Oh gosh, you're making me depressed now as well around this all. I do want to kind of have something more positive. I mean, is there anything that you've seen over the last, say, 6 months or past 12 months that you think could be a seed of positivity. I mean,
Yeah.
there was the spending caps you mentioned from the the last potential the debt issue that came up earlier this year. Admittedly, no one's following it, but that's something. Are there other things that could be potentially positive here?
Yeah, so let me give a note of optimism, but I'll start by telling you how bad things are, because then it's going to seem even better. But from 2015 through the beginning of 2022, politicians basically decided debt didn't matter, and that was partially driven by the low interest rates. It was partially driven by they figured out some more fun to cut taxes and increase spending. But year after year after year, it really started under Obama. It got way worse under Trump, and then it continued to be bad under Biden. They just kept passing tax cuts and spending increases and tax cuts and spending increases, and they didn't pay for anything. That started to turn around with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This is a Democratic-only bill. Wasn't big deficit reduction. Again, when the dust has settled, it may even increase the deficit a little bit, but it was designed to be paid for. They didn't try to add to the credit card. They tried to pay for it. They came with a pay for it. So that was really important turning point. After that, we had the Fiscal Responsibility Act. This is a bipartisan agreement between the president and speaker of the House, passed both houses of Congress by pretty wide margins, to reduce deficits by the equivalent of $1.5 trillion over a decade. Not perfect, lots of problems with it. We still have to implement, but that was an important step in the right direction. We're now building on that further at some levels, I think, with growing conversation over a possible bipartisan fiscal commission. We saw late in the shutdown negotiations, we saw a bipartisan group in the House of a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans come out together and say, we recognize that we can't solve this through regular order. And so we are proposing a special commission to look at this issue and try to come to agreement. These commissions do not guarantee success. I worked on 2 of them. They don't guarantee success, but they have a small chance of having a huge impact. They have a small chance that they come to an agreement that really changes our fiscal trajectory. And they have a large chance, or a medium chance at least, of having a decent impact. Commissions that don't result in legislation often do change the conversation in Washington, often do develop new policy ideas, often do facilitate higher level negotiations between the president and leadership. And so I'm encouraged by all the calls for this commission. And I think that if it happens, it could be a big step forward.
Okay, so maybe we'll end the main part of the conversation on that note, a somewhat positive note, with a backdrop that the debt levels are too high and the trajectory looks terrible going forward. Now, I did want to round off with 1 or 2 personal questions. One was, we have some of our audience are younger at university. They're going to leave to enter the workforce either now or in a year's time. What advice would you give to young people as they enter the real world, the world that you describe in terms of work or careers and so on?
Well, I can just tell you what I did, which is that I tried to find a niche that was something that not many people knew about, but that could fit into kind of a broader, fit into something broader. So my niche was Social Security policy, was very specific, but that could be part of retirement policy. That could be part of fiscal policy. And something I've loved about my job working the federal budget for the last 16 years is I've had to become an expert on every policy, because every policy touches the federal budget. So yeah, I love Social Security, but some years, some days, I'm talking about tax policy. Sometimes it's healthcare policy. Sometimes it's military and military benefits policy. Sometimes it's macroeconomic policy, the amount of inflation and interest rates. It's really cool to be able to touch all of those areas. And so, I don't know, try to be a generalist and a specialist at the same time. If you can, don't be afraid to hustle. Don't be afraid to send some annoying emails. Don't send too many, but if you have somebody that you're interested in, reach out to them, try to get a coffee, get an informational interview. It can't hurt.
Right, that's excellent. So that's my dog in the background there. Someone's knocked on the door. But I did also want to ask you, what are some of the books that really influence you of your career?
Oh, I've read back to Social Security. I've read so many books on Social Security. My favorite one was there was a political scientist that happened to be embedded in a member of Congress in 1982 and 83, the last time they actually fixed Social Security. His name is Paul Light, and he wrote a book called Artful Work, The Politics of Social Security Reform. And the idea of 1983 legislation was, it wasn't a work of art. The piece of legislation that they came up with wasn't a kind of a beautiful fix to the Social Security system, but it was artful work. They figured out how to finesse all the politics to get to something that actually saved the program. And it's just a great mix of policy history and kind of understanding of the substance. It's a short, easy read, but for anybody that's interested in kind of in policy making and how you come to solutions, it's a worthwhile one.
Okay, I'll make sure to include that in the show notes. And then finally, what's the best way for people to reach out to, follow your work, see the work of the CRFB?
Yeah, so we have a great website, if I do say so myself, called at crfb.org. We have a blog, we have papers, but we also have some very cool interactive tools. Tools to how would you extend the tax cuts, tools for how you'd build your own child tax credit, something called the Debt Fixer, where you can basically build your own comprehensive plan to fix the debt. Something called the Social Security Reformer. Go to socialsecurityreformer.org. We go to high school classes and make them fix Social Security. We've gone to members of Congress, and they've actually written legislation using our Social Security Reformer. So like it's for all levels, high schoolers all the way down to members of Congress. Anybody can use, anyone can use this tool. So I definitely recommend going to our website. If you're a nerd and want to read the blogs, that's great. But if not, play some of our interactive tools. That's a really good engagement opportunity. And feel free to reach out to me. It's my last name at crfb.org, Goldwein at crfb.org.
I'll include the links to all of those bits of information as well. Great. So with that, thanks a lot for the really insightful conversation, somewhat depressing, but it was really useful and for putting some context around this big topic.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.